so far what we've been doing is going through these various categories and trying to be somewhat more analytical about them than is normally the case. So then the next step is, to what kind of use historically have these categories been put? And we actually have three canonical kinds of use. So this is just building a broad brushstrokes theory about social diversity and the way in which it's handled. The three categories are exclusion, assimilation, and an aspirational kind of universe that we call civic pluralism. So what I want to talk about is, I want to talk about the way in which each of these kinds of models of dealing with difference operates in its typical form. So let's take exclusion first. So what we have with exclusion is around, let's say, social class. Clearly, if only the rich people can afford to go to very expensive schools and poor people go to relatively not very good local schools, that ends up creating patterns of exclusion. Clearly, if we have a school which is an all-boys school or an all-girls school, there's patterns of exclusion. Clearly, if we have schools which push out of the system students with particular disabilities, for example, schools for the blind or schools for the disabled or whatever, that's a process of exclusion. So, and what we've done along the way is we've had these radical systems of exclusion. We've had, in South Africa, apartheid was exclusion based on this problematic notion of race. We've had exclusions around sex and sexuality, which is you can't be anything other than heteronormativity in relation to that classical polarity of male and female. We have exclusions around language, which is the only language we teach here. We have exclusions around communities of commitment, where we set up schools for one particular group of people. So I can go through all of this and I can find examples of this which range from apartheid and assimilation and stuff, real bad stuff in many, many ways, and things which reproduce the structures of inequality in really problematic ways. I can also find moments where the exclusion might be justified. What's the argument for having an all-girls school? What's the argument for having a school that teaches in a minority language or teaches a particular set of religious commitments? In a society which values pluralism, there may be moments of exclusion which are not exclusionary in the sense of a whole system of social exclusion, but which are actually strategies to inclusion, strategies to civic pluralism, to allow that these differences are able to thrive and live in ways which are relatively autonomous. So, complicated idea. The second model we have is assimilation, which is, the argument is there that we can deal with differences on the condition that the people who are different from the norm become like the norm. So, okay, we'll take you into the school, but you've got to learn English. You don't know English now, we'll teach you English, or you'll learn it by sink and swim methodology. And what we've had at various periods of time is a whole lot of policies around assimilation. So, for example, immigrant assimilation for many, many decades was, okay, we've got all these people coming in to populate our labour force from the ends of the earth, but the condition is they assimilate to the nation. They become citizens, loyal citizens of the new nation, and eventually they will shed all their differences. Same with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples who are invaded, that will set up schools for them, we'll have missions that teach them religion, and that they can become like us. So the difference between exclusion and assimilation is that exclusion says you are irretrievably different and can't be like us, which was why we need to set up these very strict boundaries. Us on one side of the boundary and you on the other. Assimilation is a set of conditions where you can cross that boundary, right? So in a way, it's very, very different and has very, very different consequences in terms of the way in which social policy plays out. Now, civic pluralism is something which is kind of aspirational, and what we mean when we use the word inclusive education, it's a version of what we would call civic pluralism. Often there are kind of relatively weak versions of it, like multiculturalism. We need something more serious than that, which is basically the differences can live together productively, and in fact the differences add value to society. They're things which don't take away, they don't require assimilation, and they can be productive and generative, and in fact the kinds of cosmopolitanism, the kinds of inventiveness and innovation that come with civic pluralism are an ethos for the future. So one of our questions is to what extent the future can, or to what extent education in specifically and society in general can aspire to these aims. Remembering, by the way, that there might be moments of assimilation. So we might value difference, but we're also teaching, when we do bilingualism and ESL in a school, we're valuing the difference because we want you to keep your home and first languages, but also we want you to learn English because that's will give you a certain level of access to society. So within civic pluralism, there might be moments of assimilation, and there might be moments of strategic exclusion, which is we're going to have a women's group to talk about particular issues around sexism, for example, and that won't involve any men. So there might be moments where within a larger framework that's entirely compatible with what we call civic pluralism.